So today I wanted to talk about Fukyugata Ichi. Once we have figured out the basic moves of Fukyugata Ichi, it is important to kind of revisit the kata, and it is important to revisit any kata in this manner to really to get a better sensation of what we want to do. Because Fukyugata Ichi is so seemingly simple, it's an ideal kata for us to concentrate some of the more obscure elements, such as hip work, leg work, stance work, and the use of muscles during and at the end and at the beginning of transitional moves and so on. So once we're past the stage in Fukyugata Ichi where we've got the embusson down and we know what we're doing in terms of the kata and the bunkai that we're introduced to and so on. One thing that may be interesting for people is to look at the next kind of level of detail in the kata. First of all, the start of going into Zenkutsu Dachige Danbarai, especially with attention to ensuring that the leg placement and the foot placement is accurate before any hip work has been initiated. So that really is an important thing to concentrate on, to make sure that a foot placement is not secured in a parallel fashion and then corrected with the hip and the legs, but that the front foot is always placed at least where we're taught the opponent is to be found. So if the opponent is at a 90-degree angle from the start of the karate practitioner's perspective, right, then we have to ensure the foot is placed accurately facing the opponent, as well as making sure that the big toe and the knee are aligned directly facing the opponent, and making sure that there's a lot of tension in the back leg, which is going to be used as a spring in order to transfer the force to the hip to complete the action. The other thing to note, which may be of importance, is not to take a linearly downward slope, meaning a linearly downward slope, but in fact taking more of a non-linear slope. So first getting close to the earth, close to the floor, and then pushing out. We have to play around with that to see how we can better balance, being in balance and the speed at which we get there. If we just take a linear direct path, we can get there fast, but we're not going to get there in a balanced manner. And we're susceptible and vulnerable to being thrown off balance. If we take too long of time to really get down and then push out, then, we're staying very much in balance, but we may be taking too much of a conservative approach, such that we become less predictable in what we're doing. It is important to balance the two out, such that when we do finally execute the move, it is kind of a mixture of both, and it feels like you're both challenging your speed as well as your power, as well as your balance. And in that triangle of speed, power, and balance, we have to make sure continually to ensure that all of them are being challenged whenever we're doing the kata, such that when we do end up executing the move, we have a very solid approach to it. The use of the hip is very important. Once the leg placement is accurate and there's sufficient bend in the knees, The hips can sometimes just be rotated in place, like this. And that is not the intent of the move, because what then ends up in resulting is insufficient bend at the front knee. And what we're really looking for during the hip execution is a push of the back leg and a pull of the hamstring of the front leg. So once we've established connection with the new stance, we'd like to have the tension translated to linearity and rotational angular momentum at the same time. So we're striving to see not only a push and a hamstring pull at the same time, so a linear translation resulting in this forward translation of the whole torso. But at the same time, we're looking for a turn of the back leg translating into a hip rotation. So we have a translation and a rotation happening at the same time. And we find that in karate that is quite common. Most things in motion in karate have a translationary and a rotationary component to it. And that engages the muscles in different ways in order to perhaps add to the force or add to the unpredictability and so on. But those are important elements. A simple motion is easier for the opponent to track, a simple rotational or a simple translationary motion. But if it's rotational and translationary, such as a punch, then it becomes a little bit more difficult for the opponent's body to react to it. At least that's the thinking behind it. So we have to ensure that we are not only rotating the hips, you should practice and experiment with this. As we rotate the hips, the front knee tends to want to come back simply because of the anatomy. We want to compensate for that, overcompensate for that by pushing off the back leg and pulling in with the hamstrings. A lot of karate instructors that I've been with have always reminded us to push off the back leg. But imagining your hamstring of your front leg engage as well gives that extra bit of kick. It's a bit like hikite during a punch. So another important thing about stance translation is we are always literally using both legs and the muscles of both legs at the same time. If we have a mental condition that focuses only on one aspect of it, then we tend to not extract the full extent of our potential. So what we want to concentrate on is utilizing both legs, the hips, abs, all together into what ends up becoming a translatory and a rotationary motion at the same time. It's important to practice this because it will lead to a lot of clarity in some of the other stances that we use, right? So it's important to practice that. Once we've got that down, the next move is also interesting. Coming in from a Gedanbarai Zenkutsudachi to a front punch. When we learn the moves of the kata and the construct of the kata, the emphasis for the first time, we may overlook some of the detail that's in the hip and the stance work that is present. So for example, we'll just execute the move and keep on going. And we don't really pay too much attention to it, maybe because we're trying to work for our next belt or whatever. But once the pressures of all the belt and everything is removed from the equation, then, like I said in the beginning, we tend to come back and revisit. Once we've executed our first move, we're not going to be talking about bunkai in this video. Coming in over here, in Okinawan styles, the Zenkutsudashi Gedanbara is executed such that there's full hip rotation. So the hips are square at the end. In Shotokan, the Gedanbara is executed with a 45-degree hip angle, similar to what we find in Goju-Shio later on, accentuating more of the blocking motion in Shotokan and more of the essence in the Okinawan traditional karate, which can be interpreted as not just a block. Obviously, with a full hip motion there, a lot more can go on. It is important to practice the full hip motion move, even if you're used to Shotokan, because the full hip motion move will set you up properly for the upcoming punch. Okay, what we're looking for in translating from a Gedanbarai Zenkutsudashi to a Shizentai Dashi, natural stance. Of course, if you're performing Shotokan, you go back into, you go straight from Zenkutsudashi to Zenkutsudashi. But in the Matsubayashi-Ryu that I'm currently practicing, Zenkutsudashi to Shizen, to natural stance over here. The translation is quite interesting. Because the hips are fully square, we cannot simply use our back leg to translate to the front. Okay? What we need to utilize, in fact, from this stance is a fall forward, literally a fall. We allow the front knee to collapse forward in a controlled fashion, this way, right? This is the interesting starting point of the transition into move. So the front knee collapses a little bit, and the back leg is fired like a rocket into placement position of the foot first. So before any hip is engaged, that needs to happen. So really, the foot placement occurs first. It's a collaboration between the two legs again, right? So not only is the back leg trying to get to the natural stance placement as soon as possible, with the hips remaining square, but the front leg is assisting by collapsing forward, enabling that momentum to build up. You have to think in terms of how there could be a lot of stuff up here, meaning torsos, bodies, locks, engagements, and underneath all that, there's a lot of activity going on. It's a bit like unearthing a bit of grass and seeing that underneath there's a whole new universe full of, you know, worms and beetles and things like that. There's a lot of activity going on down here. And both legs need to work in unison again. So it has to be a forward energy, collapsing the front leg forward, the knee ushering forward, and the back leg coming into the natural stance position. This is a wind-up position, which will then, as it unwinds, results in the force for the punch. What is interesting is that while the hips are square at the end of Gedanbarai, when the front knee collapses a little bit, we regenerate that position, which we find is the end of the Gedanbarai position in Shotokan, right? So while the hips are square in the execution of Gedanbarai, as the hip and the knee is ushered forward to go into the next stance, we find that we go from a square hip instantaneously to a 45-degree hip, right? And we retrieve the back leg for the new stance. Now we've got a hip that is kind of fully set to unwind, and as it unwinds, we come in with a punch. Okay, so making sure that the initial footwork is set correctly, making sure the hip is executed square, and then assisting the hip again, not in a jerky motion like I'm trying to exaggerate, but in a more of a fluid motion. So from here engages over here. And then we utilize that to generate the motion. The same thing happens on the way back to a Zenkutsu Dachigen. So it is not, what we're looking for is not simply a leg translation to Zenkutsu Dachigen, but we're looking for that hip unwind and rewind again. So once we're in natural stance, we want to utilize our hamstrings, right, at the back. For pushing movements, we always concentrate on our quads. In karate, it is important to build both your anterior, such as your biceps and your quads and your abs, and your posterior muscles, such as your lats, your back, your hamstrings, and your triceps. They're both used equally, 50-50. One is not more important than the other. So when going back in this manner, it is important to fully utilize the hamstrings, the calves, the back, the lats, and get into that motion as quickly as possible, which will aid in the translation. When we set our foot for the Gedanburai, right, we are in fact in a position where the hip is in neutral over here, back in Jigotai. And it can be used again with a push of the back leg and a pull of the front leg, and the translation and the rotation at the same time, which is what we started the kata off with, right? And same on the other side, where we utilize that collapse of the knee, right? Collapse of the knee, placement of the foot, translation of the leg, unwind it through the hip into a punch, right? And so on. So it is important to pay attention to those first four moves, because there's a lot going on there that versus what we initially realized. Now, why is that important? It adds the elasticity into our karate that we may lack in the beginning. Karate has this reputation of being the iron rod, and Kung Fu is, the whip and so on, which is incorrect, right? If we look at karate, there is as much width and elasticity in there as any other martial art, and there's as much iron rod in any other martial art as karate. It's just how we interpret things to be, because everybody just has two arms and two legs, and there's only so many things we can do, right? But so it is important to practice all that, right, with a little bit more serious. Once you got the moves down, more serious translation, right? And you can just keep on going. You can make a series out of it. You can make a series out of it, going back and forth, and just get that movement right. So, hope that helps you, and good luck with your practice.